Nudgestock 2018 was the Ogilvy and Mather Behavioral Science Festival. It was June 8th and it was in Folkestone, United Kingdom. And what's wonderful about the internet is that even though you and I couldn't attend Nudgestock, we still get to participate in it thanks to YouTube videos. So that's our destination. And anyone that has watched Rory Sutherland, the executive of Ogilvy, on YouTube knows that he's a dynamic presenter. He's like a comedian, only smarter. He's like a professor, only funnier. He's the guy you meet in a pub or a party or a panel and think, that was great. And I didn't go to Nudgestock, and you probably didn't either, but we can still jam out to the hits of this album together. So we're going to do a collection of notes, ideas, and lists from the event. And thanks to Ogilvy Consulting UK for putting all of these videos up on the YouTube trailer. I watched those videos, and then using Wikipedia and suggested videos, we're going to go in a couple related directions. Ready? First up is Caroline Webb, and Caroline Webb wants you to have a great day. Yay, but not in the rah-rah kind of way, but in a t-test kind of way. Webb wants you to use behavioral science on yourself. So rather than the typical internet advice of this worked for me, she presents research on how this has worked for others. In her talk, she highlights 3 specific areas: selective attention, ambiguity, aversion, and the peak-end rule. And these ideas were observed in real life, studied in the lab, and returned to real life. They're like the latest tech product, only it's for your gray matter software. Webb began, let me tell you about this day a few years ago that didn't start off as well as it might. Webb flew to Germany for a workshop, and she arrived the day before, arranged her presentation and props in the room, and then went to her hotel for a good night's sleep. And she turns out she wakes up late, not just to get ready, but late enough to even arrive on time. So she decides, either in the moment or with hindsight, to use this case as an example of her research. Could she use behavioral psychology to turn a late start into a great start? For selective attention, she said, basically, that determines how you experience reality. So if you seek something, you see it. And the reason this happens is because we filter out most of what is around us. We don't know what we're not missing. In one study, Harvard radiologists were asked to perform a lung nodule detection task in a gorilla, which was about 50 times the size of an average nodule, was inserted into the last case. So if you can imagine, it looks like more like a CT scan than an X-ray, but imagine that sort of cross-section of the human body, and then there's this gorilla that's inserted there, and it's not super obvious if you Google it, but if you're an expert, you definitely should see it. But only 17% noticed the gorilla. And in this study, the Harvard researchers had eye tracking software, so people were looking at it, but they weren't seeing it. And that's this idea of selective attention. Webb said that's how powerful our filtering mechanism can be. And it's not just objects; it's even more subtle. Confirmation bias is an example of how your expectations will shape what you perceive. And if you think about the neurology of your brain as like paths through the woods, the more frequently you go down certain paths, the more well-worn and easier to travel those paths will be. And so Webb grabbed at this idea, and it really shifted her day. She wasn't running late because she was an unprepared person. Setting up the room the night before was evidence against that, but she had an unprepared moment. Reframing her approach was important. She said, our starting point as we go into any situation strongly determines what we seem to perceive as reality. She had to change her stance because we have ambiguity, aversion. We don't like feeling uncomfortable about something. Webb explains, what happens when you are feeling uncomfortably, unpleasantly stressed is that you just become dumber. Just at the moment you need to rise to a challenge, you can't think straight. The more possible a threat, the larger our response. It's the flight, fight, or freeze response. And this comes from what Danny Kahneman personified in our fast thinking. There aren't really fast and slow parts of the brain, Kahneman wrote, but the metaphor is effective. Slow, deliberate, computational thinking can help avoid the physiological distress of ambiguity. Webb's being late was a sunk cost and should have little influence on her current actions. Webb's final trick from the bag of human ticks is the peak end rule. This is the idea that people tend to remember the most intense, good or bad, part and the ending. For example, patients prefer longer lasting but less painful colonoscopy conclusions. Webb said, "What researchers have shown is that we don't tend to code every moment of the day. What we do is we tend to take advantage of the average of the peak, good or bad, and the way that something ends." Webb's goal was to create a high peak and a good end. Nudgestock 2018 wasn't the only time Webb has talked about having a good day. She's written a book with a similar title and gave a nice interview at the London Google offices in 2016. There, Webb explained two themes from her research of people at work. Employees want good colleagues and fulfilling work. Patty McCord saw this at Netflix too and documented it in her book. McCord wrote, "A great workplace is not espresso or lush benefits or sushi lunches, grand parties or nice offices. Great work isn't about perks, it's about people and purpose." This tracks very closely to Webb's findings. She said, "We want to be sure we're working on the right things. We want to be sure we are being productive in pursuit of those priorities. And if we get to the end of the day and we feel we've tackled only the urgent rather than the important, there's a sense of a gap." And this was Webb's intuition, and so she wanted evidence to go with it. She said, "Some parts of coaching have an arm-waving kind of feel to it, yet there is so much amazing evidence that comes out of neuroscience, psychology, and behavioral economics. It just often doesn't make the leap from the lab to real life." And that's Webb's goal. She wants to bring the lab to real life. She wants to observe things in real life and take it back to the lab. So she really wants to iterate. At Google, Webb described the fast and slow parts of our brain as the deliberate, the grown-up stuff, and automatic, the unsung hero. But she also notes that this is an analogy used for understanding. She says, "There is almost no part of the brain where you can say, this part of the brain does this." In a different gorilla test, which you can Google on YouTube, a person in a gorilla costume walks through a group of students wearing black and white, and the viewer is asked to count the number of passes of a basketball among the students. And it's another demonstration of selective attention, and it's probably the one that most people are familiar with. And Webb says to use this selective attention to your advantage. If we take a moment, like 5 seconds before we go into a meeting, and say, what's important to me, what matters, we can improve our outcomes. You can also check in with your attitudes and assumptions because that's going to shape your reality. Then ask, what do I really want to notice about this? If you think you'll find a jerk, you'll find one. If you think Dave is always grumpy, of course he'll be grumpy again. You perceive what you expect. When I shared some quotes on Twitter from Webb's talks, there was a surprisingly large outpouring of reactions from people who have said that reframing how they approach meetings and how they approach people that they don't like working with has positively affected their time at work. Webb says that other ways to have a great day include getting enough sleep, walking around the office, shorter meetings, and even taking breaks. Her final piece of advice to the London Googlers is known as the fundamental attribution error. She said, "One of the biggest simplifications our deliberate system makes is that if you're not getting stuff done today, it's simpler for me to assume that you're no good than to say, I wonder what might be going on with her. This takes less mental energy." If you've ever heard the expression, everyone is fighting their own battle, that's a salvo against the fundamental attribution error. And it emphasizes the point that we've seen more and more, is that people tend to do what's easy for them, and that may not be what's easy for you. When we think about the habits that people have, if someone gets up early to exercise or read or do whatever the most successful people do before breakfast, that's easy for them because that's their habit. And in the same way, we use the fundamental attribution error in the wrong ways. That's a negative effect because it's easy thinking for us. Rory Sutherland also spoke at Nudgestock 2018, and he's really the best presenter. Rory is wonderful in his presentations, and there's a lot of them on YouTube. So if you don't care for this podcast, I would applaud you for turning this off and finding something from Rory Sutherland to watch on YouTube. In this talk at Nudgestock 2018, he says he's creating a new type of agency. He's calling it One Ogilvy, and he wants their marketing work, their choice architecture, their design to be more like solving a Sudoku problem. There's no division of labor anymore at Ogilvy because it's like solving the Sudoku problem where you have to fit the whole picture together. And marketing rarely has simple answers. One approach that Sutherland uses when he gets stuck is he says he tries to think of marketing problems like a crossword, where if you can't solve 3 down, try and solve 2 across and see if that helps. And part of what Sutherland uses to solve these crossword marketing problems in a Sudoku box is to focus on the social sciences. And Sutherland has an interesting take on the replication crisis. It's actually not a crisis for him. He says that he doesn't need social science to be consistent in the same way that physics is. You know, this physics, there's the same gravity basically everywhere on Earth with maybe a few small changes. But social sciences, even though it's a science, is different. This is what he says. My argument is that, as marketers and practitioners, it's the failure to replicate we're really interested in. It's about finding the context that makes a behavior feel natural. So it's okay if things don't consistently work. It's okay that the paradox of choice is true in some instances and not others. Sutherland just needs to know that there is a difference and to apply the right solution to his situation. He explained, as a business person, I go, that's fine. I just need to know that the way you design a choice has a big effect on how people choose. And I need to know also that the logical assumption isn't true. It sort of reminds me of the Warren Buffett quote, where if he sees someone who's overweight, he doesn't need to know precisely that the man weighs 327 pounds. He just needs to know that he's fat. And Sutherland, in a similar way, doesn't need to specifically know what the lab-controlled experiment told him, just that the lab-controlled experiment was ran because something interesting was going on. An example he gives in the talk is work that he's done with British Airways. British Airways, for example, had too many choices, and they learned that the secret to selling their sale fares was not to list everything, but to clump things and give people limited choices. If you wanted to go skiing, here's 3 sales. If you want to go to the beach, here's a few things for that as well. And the way these choices are framed matters as well. Like Caroline Webb's way to improve her day, Sutherland mentions how changing the words can change your thoughts. Sometimes passengers will have to deplane not at a gate, but via stairs and then to a bus, and then the bus takes you somewhere else. And no one really ever is tickled by the chance to get on the bus. But Sutherland was once on a flight, and the captain explained that this was the process, but he said that the bus is going to zip you right to custom control. So you don't have to walk through the terminal. You'll be very close to the luggage area if you're going to pick something up. You know, the stairs to ground transportation is right there. So it was the same situation. It was the exact same situation, but the pilot framed it in a way where Sutherland realized, oh, this is actually a bonus. He says that we judge things by how we compare it to something else. And we've had this adaptive preference formation for a long time. Ben Franklin wrote, "So convenient a thing to be a reasonable creature, since it enables one to find or make a reason for everything one has a mind to do." And Sutherland articulates a couple of different examples. In another talk he gave, this time on the Oh Behave podcast, he said this: I made the decision to underspend on property on the grounds that nearly everybody else was effectively maxing themselves out. The default behavior of housing was to buy as much as you can borrow. That assumes the greatest return on happiness comes from property expenditure. No one really looks at the opportunity cost. If you've got a massive mortgage, there's a holiday you can't take. There are children you can't educate. At Nudgestock 2017, Sutherland again reminded us of the quirkiness of human behavior. He said, "I think the greatest innovations of the next 50 years will come from the field of psychology rather than technology." And then he goes on to continue this thought in his book, The Wiki Man. He wrote, "What really annoys me is that they make trains faster, like the high-speed link through Kent. But there are very few tables on those trains. If I don't have a table, then I can't use my laptop. I can't have a cup of coffee. I can't have a newspaper. The whole advantage of the train has been practically eradicated." And we really focused on this idea during Rory Week on the blog. If you go to thewaiterspad.com and you search for Rory Week, you'll see all the posts we did. But his big idea is to use small things to have big effects. If you install tables in trains, that's a lot cheaper than rebuilding a rail line so that it's high speed. But we don't often do these things. We don't try to find those little things that have a big effect because we're in organizations. We have to appear logical. There's this fuzzy area of psychology and marketing that because there's a replication crisis, precisely because there's a replication crisis, we don't have the same hard data. We don't have what looks like the sturdiness of numbers to support our arguments. Sutherland gives the advice of don't look for rules, look for patterns. And then don't try to simply solve them. Easy problems like the levels in Tetris have already been cleared, and most problems that we have now are unnoticed or unsolved because what Sutherland calls their logic proof. If there was a logical answer, we would have done it. So with these weird problems, Sutherland thinks we should try weird solutions, things that defy conventional wisdom. Maybe big data will work, but it's certainly not a silver bullet, and it's not a panacea. Data means numbers, and it means logic, and the person who presents them can look like a scientist. They can look very organized, and no one has ever gotten fired for being logical. You're more likely to be fired for being unimaginative. Starbucks is one example that Sutherland cites. No one ever would have thought it was logical to charge $5 for a coffee and then have some place to sit and drink it, but it's worked. The same with Sunglass Hut in the airport. Sutherland, it seems, spends a lot of time on planes and trains, and he says, spend 8 minutes in a Sunglass Hut in Terminal 5 and suddenly an 80-pound pair of spectacles seems really reasonable. So not pound as in weight, but pound as in money. And these are things you have to understand if you're going to affect how people make decisions. Some of this stuff will be in big data, but some of it's not. Sutherland says don't go around repeating the same buzzwords that everyone else says. He says if you go to the Cannes Film Festival, you'll hear buzzwords, 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 buzzwords. And he jokes that if you want to hear the same words repeated over and over again, it's much cheaper to become a Buddhist. Ruth Morgan is a forensic scientist, and she gave one of the shorter talks at the conference. And even though it was short, it was kind of dire. She pointed out that people lose up to 100 hairs a day and 40,000 skin cells an hour. And that's not really a problem per se, but unless some of your DNA ends up at a crime scene, and then what happens? And Morgan introduces something called the cascading bias, that the initial impressions have an outsized influence on our conclusions. And if we think of things as path-dependent, if you think of things as a decision tree, you can see how this could really have dangerous effects, where once you get initially sorted into something, it's really hard to go back, and as humans we don't have a tendency to reconsider those assumptions. And Morgan says that there's evidence that people in law enforcement and other investigative services are as prone to the same errors as everyone else. She said that evidence in 22% of one group of appeal cases was misinterpreted, and so that means almost 1/4 of cases. And part of the reason they were misinterpreted is this cascading bias, where people thought one thing, but the actual answer was another. In another study, she dressed a male skeleton in woman's clothes, and then she buried it and asked forensic specialists to excavate the grave and identify the body. And when it was dressed as a woman, the specialists were somewhere in the middle. They were kind of confused. Most of them marked the remains as unidentifiable. And then for another group, Morgan dressed the skeleton in men's clothes, and most felt confident that it was a male. So you have a male skeleton and you put it in men's clothes, and most people think it's a male. And you have a male skeleton, you put it in women's clothes, and most of the specialists were uncertain. And then when she presented the skeleton without any clothes on, the specialist that came in said that the skeleton was very likely to be male. And so we have these three instances, and we have these different situations, and her guess is that it's the cascading bias, that we start down one path and then we have a hard time changing our minds. Nicholas Christakis joined Nudgestock 2018 to talk about networks, and he's an academic focused on the effects of networks and how effective networks can be. Our social networks are consistent, and this turns out to be not coincidental. Christakis says, we form social networks with very particular mathematical properties. Natural selection and evolution have shaped not only our individual tastes for friendship, but the way we organize ourselves into networks. And we must organize ourselves in this way because it must be beneficial to be organized in this way. During prehistoric times, there were probably tribes where people kept to themselves, and those people who kept to themselves, those tribes of isolation, were probably as robust. They probably endured in the same way that a four-finger person or someone with a human tail did. They just weren't optimized for survival, but socially formed groups are. Probably. It would be nice to know. We can't travel back in time. But Christakis thinks that he did the next best thing. He studied the Hadza tribe in Tanzania. And this tribe, anthropologists think, moves and sleeps and interacts like we probably did. And he said, to make a long story short, their network looks just like ours. So what he did was Christakis and his research assistants went to Tanzania, and they printed out a poster board, and they took pictures of everyone, and they put the pictures on the poster board, and then they would sit down and they would wait. And when someone from the tribe wandered by, they would ask them, who do you know on this board? And the tribe's member would point out the people that they knew, and then Christakis went back to his lab and he graphed the results, and the visual of their social network looks just like the social network that you have or the one that I have. And Christakis said, despite the fact that in the intervening 10,000 years we've invented agriculture, cities, and telecommunications, the structure of our social networks is indistinguishable from this population that lives like we did during the Pleistocene. So what? This is more than what do you have in common with your ancestors. It actually has kind of interesting effects where our attitudes and our decisions and our behaviors actually kind of depend on the people we are directly and indirectly connected with. And Christakis explained 3 ways that we affect each other. There's social contagion. That's the domino effect. This is like the pay it forward idea. I'm kind to you, which makes you kind to her, and her kind to him, and so on. There's homophony, where people have similar interests, where birds of a feather flock together, Christakis said. And there's also conditional, where we live near a certain thing, and so we act in certain ways. For example, this summer my family moved to Florida, and we have a pickleball court where no one in my family had ever even heard about pickleball, but because there's this pickleball court nearby, we go and we play. So, like the other ideas at Nudgestock 2018, there's not a single answer. Christakis says that these 3 things, social contagion, homophony, conditionality, those 3 things interact, but they interact in really interesting ways. So for one experiment, he created a public goods game. I think he did this with Amazon's Mechanical Turk, but you can always watch the presentation for the full details. And in it, if the participants cooperated, the size of the pie would increase, and then the individual slices would also grow. And if participants were uncooperative, the pie would shrink, and so would the slices. And Christakis wanted to know if kindness was contagious. So if I'm kind to you, are you kind to him? And the answer was yes to the third degree. And so this is what it looks like according to his research. If you were kind to a barista this morning, the barista would be more kind to her friend would be more kind to her boss, and her boss would be kind to her son. So that's the pay it forward effect, he says, is real. Networks magnify whatever they are seeded with. Networks are agnostic. Networks are not good. Networks are not bad. They just are. And if you change the network connections, you can change the outcomes. If you change patient 0 in a network, you can change the whole network outcomes. If you change the nodes or connections of the network, you can change the network outcomes. His talk was definitely the most interesting. It wasn't, the others were entertaining, they all were very good, but Christakis' talk was stuff that I had never even heard before. In another experiment, Christakis let people switch their connections. So it's like unfriending someone or not having a neighbor anymore. And he noticed that people became more cooperative. And he said this: the gist of the experiment is that I can take you people and connect you according to one set of rules, and you're mean sons of bitches to each other. Or I can take you and connect you by a different set of rules, and you're sweet and kind to each other. It's the same people. Different architecture yields different emergent properties of the system. The idea that I am who I am is bunk, according to research like this. Conditions matter. In another experiment, Christakis let people see who among them was rich and who among them was poor. And when riches were visible, resentment grew. It wasn't the inequality that mattered so much, but it was the visibility. Christakis said, "This paper rolled my left-wing heart. The punchline is that inequality didn't make a big difference, but visibility did. What really matters is not how unequal the worlds were, but whether you could see each other's wealth or not." In another study, Christakis looked at where to intervene, who should get a treatment or a message to maximize the spread through the network. And Christakis found tipping points and earned a grant to study 30,000 people in 176 villages. His full presentation is really good. It's full of nice pictures and advanced mathematics, but anyone can use the idea. I had no network sciences background to understand this, and it was all very educational. And he introduces something called the friendship paradox, and that's the idea that your friend will have more friends than you, and this is an idea from network science. And so, for example, if you were trying to get a message out, if you were the vice principal of a high school and you wanted a message to spread through the school, the best thing you could do is to ask someone who their best friend is. And then you give the message to the person who is the best friend. Because according to the mathematics of networks, that person is more likely to be connected than the person you initially ask. This is all important. This is really helpful because Christakis has this idea called social capital. And just like physical capital, like wood can make homes, human capital through books and conferences, YouTube clips, and podcasts can transform how people think. Social capital through network improvements might be a thing too, Christakis says. Just like physical capital is created by a change in the material world, and human capital by a change in persons, social capital in organizations, villages, companies, schools, and factories, in our whole society, is a change in our relations among persons, a change that renders a group more productive and capable of doing things it was not previously able to do. Christakis' presentations were really interesting, and so I watched some other things that he had done. In one presentation, he presents to a group of people, and he thanks Albert Laszlo Barabasi for inviting him. And so I had to Google Barabasi, and he didn't speak at Nudgestock, but he has given some interesting talks of his own about network effects. And Barabasi noted the ubiquity of networks as well. He said that networks are everywhere, and friendships, galaxies, and protein structures all actually have the same shape network. So if you were to visualize it, if you were to graph it, you would see basically the same shape. And it's also the network that houses the Kevin Bacon game. But again, so these visuals are incredible. They're beautiful images, but so what? This idea is useless. And Barabasi points out that the Kevin Bacon game is kind of fun, but so what? You have to know the paths to be able to get back to Kevin Bacon, and you don't know the paths unless you have a complete map. How do we know that Taylor Swift has a Bacon number of 2? Well, she was in the Lorax with Jack Angle, who was in Balta with Kevin Bacon. So for movies and entertainment, we have a map. And we haven't always had the map. In 1959, the idea was that networks were kind of random, and at the end of the day, they would be very uniform, that we'd all have roughly the same number of friends. But research quickly pointed out that this is actually not the case. Networks have deep organizing principles, and many networks are alike despite the nodes and links being different. So networks are not random. Around the time that Barabasi began his research, there were 2 guys from Stanford who had similar thoughts. Their names were Larry and Sergey, and they thought connections between websites might indicate importance. And Barabasi was on the same path, but he was trying to write a paper rather than build a dominant internet company. He jokes about this in his presentations. And Barabasi found a log distribution in the internet networks. A few nodes had the bulk of the connections. Almost everyone linked to Google, Yahoo, or CNN. And many fewer people link to my blog, for example. And once you realize that this is a log distribution and not a normal distribution, it's very different. Web pages look like an air traffic control map. You have a lot of flights going into Toronto, New York, Dallas, Atlanta, Los Angeles. You have many fewer flights going into Austin, Columbus, Indianapolis. And if you compare the air traffic map to a map of United States highways, you see quite the difference. Atlanta has 6 asphalt tentacles, but there are many more flights into and out of that city. So airports and internets and friendships, those are what's called a scale-free network. And again, so what? We're still terming things. We're still drawing pictures. And so if you think about communications, one company approached Barabasi and asked why their messages weren't being communicated throughout the organization. So much like Christakis' work, only instead of vitamins or vaccines, this organization approached Barabasi and wanted to know about their message spread. So again, we get to this idea that the form of a network, the structure of a network, affects how a message will spread. And so Barabasi mapped a network, and he asked people questions like, who do you turn to when you have organizational matters, and where do you get your jobs from? And he found something that looked remarkably like the flights, friendships, or internet. A few people held many connections, and many people held few. And the kicker is that salary was loosely, inversely related to connection. So the more you were paid, the less connected you tended to be. This is a big red flag. If you're a boss and you aren't connected, you are missing what Andy Grove calls the winds of the real world. This is consistently a mistake in business, and being connected to the real world, talking to your customers on a regular basis, is also a common theme of successful insights in businesses. Barabasi said, the biggest nodes are coming from the bottom of the organization. We call this node associate, but it means that he has no management role. Who is that guy? And it turned out that the central connector was the de facto leader, and he was Barabasi says, a safety management fellow who was very talkative. This mapping is helpful not only for enhancing communications, but for warning C-suite residents. There's something very powerful about the winds of the real world. We bring it up again and again in the podcast because it's an idea that is so important. Scale-free networks have an advantage to them. They're really robust. Scale-free networks exist because they are survivors. These scale-free networks tend to grow in the scale-free way. We connect to things that are larger. People linked to Google because it was a good source of what they wanted, so more people linked to Google and so on. And Barabasi calls this preferential attachment. So unlike the initial research where people thought networks were random, there is this preferential attachment where we tend to connect, where networks tend to be linked in ways where the more popular something is, the more likely the next addition to the network will be connected to it. And sometimes it takes a long time for these networks to form. It took 8 billion years to grow networks like in our cells, Barabasi says. It took 25 years to grow the internet, and sometimes it takes moments, like in a computer simulation. And with changes in the structure, we can change the outcomes of the network. Evolution has equipped humans with a lot of redundancy: 2 eyes, 2 lungs, many fingers, and so on. Even our cellular biology, because it's a scale-free network, is a survivor. Barabasi said, many natural systems have this amazing ability to function even when some of the nodes are broken. If you have a large network and start knocking out nodes randomly, the network can survive a long time. Atlanta, Detroit, and Salt Lake City are Delta hubs, but the airline also flies into Omaha, Sun Valley, and Albuquerque. And there are a lot more Albuquerques than there are Atlantas. So if there's a random attack on a scale-free network, that network can survive a really long time. In fact, the critical point is almost won, Barabasi says, because there are so many more peripheral nodes than there are central nodes. But they do have an Achilles heel, Barabasi said. For cell biology, this is all good news. Random failures will not necessarily destroy a cell, but you could design a strategy to kill bacteria or cancer cells if you know the underlying network. So Barabasi and Christakis are both connected in this idea that the way networks are formed, the network structure, really matters if you want to change something. At Nudgestock 2018, Mark Brooks talked about internet dating, and as a married 36-year-old with 2 kids, these numbers and some of these ideas were all new to me. He said that half of single people have created a dating profile, and 1 in 6 reports they are quite addicted to it. Now more people meet and get married through internet dating sites than they do through friends. Dating remains the most personal of all sales, and technology has changed how it works. With classifieds, people had to scan, spot, and select. With technology, they search. Tech and mobile, Brooks points out, also allow messaging. You don't have to send a letter. You can connect immediately. While there have been some positive changes, like from classifieds to search, there's still a lot of work to do, and behavioral economics might help. That's why Brooks is talking at Nudgestock. Brooks said that people tend to be myopic, focusing on what they think they like, and plus, as the challenges of a wealthy retirement or healthy lifestyle suggest, we aren't great at planning for the long term, especially not compared to the short. Brooks says that the holy grail for sites is to find out not how just to get people together, but to keep them together. In multiple talks, Brooks highlights a Consumer Reports survey, which showed that about the only thing people like about dating apps are the price, and that's when they're free, and some of the apps for phones have good user interface. Those aren't great metrics as far as customer feedback goes. Brooks's road to Damascus moment was actually to Duke University to meet Dan Ariely. He rocked my world, Brooks said about meeting Ariely, and he introduced him to behavioral economics, including the halo effect. Brooks explained, when you look at a profile on an internet dating site, you'll see some positive things, and if it's a fairly short profile, you'll give the benefit of the doubt to the other elements of the profile. So shorter dating profiles are better, and the trick is to have just enough. Dating sites need to combine human psychology and new technology. When Brooks worked for Plenty of Fish, his team noticed that some members, you may not believe this, actually lied. Men tended to want a long-term relationship in their profile, but revealed wanting a short-term one in their search results. And women, though less so, kind of lied in the opposite way. Brooks and his team found a workaround. He said, we ignore what you said and focus on what you're doing. So we can update the adage to show me your checkbook, calendar, and search results, and I'll tell you what you really value. What Brooks did was if Bob's profile indicated he wanted a long-term relationship, but Bob's search results prioritized hookups, then Bob's profile would not show up in Mary's searches for a long-term match. Kahneman's thinking fast and slow influenced Brooks too. Look at Tinder and Hot or Not, Brooks explained. Tinder is very much System 1. It's shareable, it's fun, it's a game, and all you're doing is swiping right. It's very emotional. Like, don't like. Hot or Not was System 2 because instead of doing the swiping, they had a 1 to 10 score. And so the lesson here is a consistent lesson we hear. Keep it simple, stupid. If you want to design something, make it easy to process. Make it something that applies to someone's System 1. And Brooks recommends the Steve Krug book, Don't Make Me Think. We'll get to Krug in just a moment. Brooks said, people are really moving toward images, which are firmly in System 1. Look at your kids age 1 to 20. They're not texting. They're looking at video, and they're looking at photographs and images, and they're communicating and telling stories through photographs and images. Online dating has mostly solved the communication and identification problems using technology, and online dating will need to solve the complications and relations problems through psychology. Brooks has some really interesting takes on Facebook. And I don't know where Facebook was in their controversy cycle when Brooks prepared and gave his talks, but he says that maybe Facebook is going to play a larger role. Maybe it'll go beyond dating, courtship, and marriage, and they'll be able to extend your Facebook use to the 7-year itch and the silver anniversary. Maybe Facebook, because they know where you've been and where you've taken pictures of, and using image searches can identify what's a special occasion and what's not. And maybe you'll get pop-up notifications on the Facebook app to say, hey, in 2 weeks, you've got this anniversary of going to this ice cream shop. Well, this ice cream shop is busy on Saturdays. So if you're going to take your significant other there, you need to make sure you're there early. Brooks gave an interesting talk, and before we go, I should clarify that when Brooks met Ariely, he was actually at MIT rather than Duke, and when I was drafting the outline for these notes, I liked the way Duke and Damascus sounded. Steve Krug did not speak at Nudgestock 2018, but he fits in with this motley crew. One of Krug's talks is titled, The Lazy Person's Guide to a Better World, Advantages of Doing the Least You Can Do. Another Krug talk is titled, Do-It-Yourself Usability Testing. Krug's religion is usability testing, and his message is, it's not that hard. This fits with behavioral economics because Krug implores listeners to take small steps. Forget redesigns and don't even think about doing something from scratch. Krug wants people to take advantage of the Pareto principle that 80% of the total results can be had with 20% of the total work. Krug says it's not rocket surgery, and he likens his work to a Tom Toro cartoon in The New Yorker. In it, a flight attendant demonstrates how to buckle an airline seatbelt, and every passenger but one is reading and not paying attention, but the one who's paying attention thinks, sweet mother of God, so that's how you buckle a seatbelt. Krug said, I always identify with this cartoon, because that's my job. Everything that Krug presents is going to be obvious to do, but obviously it's not done. In The Lazy Person's Guide to a Better World, it reflects that what Krug thinks that anyone in this business, anyone in the digital world, should be doing a fair amount of what he does, and that's validating the usability of the stuff they're creating. And there's no need to overcomplicate these things. Just pay attention to moments of pause in your own life. If you don't know where to click, if you don't know how something opens, if you don't know what something means, those are all usability moments of possible fixes. Hesitations are usability hints. Krug explains that usability testing is one of the best ways to improve the quality of anything you're designing that people are going to use. Krug wants people to be less busy and more effective. That means regular small steps toward the most important problems. Much like how dollar cost averaging in a low-cost target date fund helps financial health, and regular exercise improves physical health, regular usability testing improves design health. And Krug wants you to start like early, way sooner than you think you need to. And it doesn't need to be complicated. Keep it simple. One morning a month with a few people who were promised a good lunch is all that it really takes. Krug's presentation and his website have some excellent resources, but the most important is the mantra to prioritize and execute. Once a list of usability hesitations has been established, the most important thing is to do something small that changes them. And sites will always have usability problems. Situations will always have usability problems. Get over it. The key is to get to a good enough level. Small changes are also easier because of institutional inertia. Krug doesn't want to turn this ship around. He wants to tweak the direction. Small changes are more likely to survive the fiefdom of organizations. Engineers will see engineering solutions. Marketers will see marketing solutions. Hammers see hammering solutions. Krug says that when he's in an organization, he views these debates as almost religious because they're based on deeply held personal beliefs and nobody ever changes their mind. So to get around these religious debates, start small. One morning a month. One good lunch. Bring people in, have them use your product. If you don't have a product, that's fine. You can use a competitor's version. That idea of inverting, sometimes it's more helpful to know what not to do than what to do. Krug explains, when we're building something, it's almost impossible for us to remember that people don't know what we know, and that's kind of the biggest problem. Talking to customers or potential customers is one of the biggest pieces of advice that comes up on the blog, thewaiterspad.com. We see this time and again, and we'll keep emphasizing it time and again to, as Andy Grove said, get out and feel the winds of the real world on your face. And it's the same for IT. Even though someone in IT may not ever talk to a customer or see a customer, you do usability testing because you get to see how somebody uses your product. You get to see that experience. Again and again in his talks, Krug explained that this does not have to be complicated. His website even offers formatted questions and arrangements. Krug explains, a usability test is very simple. It's just watching people try to use what you create at the same time that they think out loud. You're looking for the question marks forming over their head. That's where you get the insights from. Sometimes it helps to see usability examples to get the ideas, and Krug suggests the book The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman. This is a classic design book, and if you get the book, you'll never look at door handles or shower handles or elevator controls or basically any buttons the same way. Tricia Wong did not speak at Nudgestock, but Sutherland cited her TED Talk as an example of why you need to be somewhere to collect data. So we'll focus on what she said in that talk. And Tricia said that the missing insight, the human insight, is what is missing from big data. And her point is that the kitchen table has information the Excel table does not. She opened her talk talking about the Oracle of Delphi, who would enter a trance and prognosticate. And even then, people wanted to know what happened. We've always wanted to know what happens. And we've gone from the Oracle of Delphi to a new deity known as big data. Big data is a $122 billion industry, and it's great in size, and so far it's low in returns. Investing in big data is easy, but knowing what to do with it is hard. Kind of like the cars in the movie series The Fast and the Furious. When those movies were released, every other Honda on the road would be tricked out. But only a handful of those drivers knew what the hell they were doing. Big data is like the great new car that not a lot of people know how to drive it yet. Tricia describes herself as a technology ethnographer, which means she says it means someone who talks to people about their culture, their habits, and customs using technology. And in 2009, she was in China. Tricia's work kind of reminded me of what Dana Boyd has done with American teenagers. Tricia said, I spent a lot of time in China getting to know the informal economy. I did things like working as a street vendor and selling dumplings to construction workers or field workers, spending nights and days in internet cafes. So once again, we are combining that real world wind with whatever information we are compiling in the office. Numbers and spreadsheets and words on pages don't quantify or qualify how people act. To know how people really feel, move, or choose, you have to be there and you have to ask them. Tricia said, I was starting to see that a big change was about to happen among low-income Chinese people, and that change was for the iPhone. It was more than a phone to the people that she was seeing. It was even better than the Narnia wardrobe or Platform 9 3/4. The iPhone was the entry into a real-life, high-tech life. She says that even though I was living with them in urban slums, I saw people investing over half their monthly income into buying a phone. And even affordable knockoffs were popular. So we have something incredible. We have someone who is there, who is looking at it, who's seeing things. And so Trisha writes up a report for the team that she's working for, and she submits it, and she presents at her employer, Nokia. She said, "Of course Nokia wouldn't see this because they're sending out surveys assuming that people don't know what a smartphone is. Of course you're not going to get any data back about people wanting to buy a smartphone in 2 years." And this is the idea that if you ask people what they want, they're going to use their existing frame to tell you what they want. But what she saw, sometimes literally in the field, was that people wanted things that they weren't articulating. They at IDEO, they called these latent needs. There's something I need right now. There's a task I want done, but I can't articulate how to have it done or what I want out of it. Nokia fell for many reasons. It's not just because they ignored one researcher in China, but not being there, not really understanding the people was one of the reasons. Trisha goes on to say, big data's reputation for success comes from quantifying very specific environments like electricity, power grids, delivery logistics, or genetic code. When we are quantifying nearly contained systems, this is another good part for understanding computers in 2018, where computers are very good at contained systems. Computers are excellent inside the aluminum box that you hold in your hands. Computers are excellent in a warehouse where it doesn't rain and the paths aren't changing. Computers are good but not perfect on the roads. Computers are great where everything is quantifiable and known, and it's a spectrum to be less great when things are more unpredictable. Big data will be beneficial. It is beneficial, but it's not a silver bullet. And Trisha says, we have this quantification bias, an unconscious belief of valuing the measurable over the immeasurable. Numbers imply logic. If X goes up, trends up, or shows up, it's good. Right? Maybe. In many of his talks, Rory Sutherland points out it's much easier to get fired for being illogical than unimaginative. And Trisha points out that quantifying can be addicting. It's very easy to throw out data because it can't be expressed as a numerical value. A key part of Clayton Christensen's disruption theory is that people aren't idiots. They do what is locally logical. When people face decisions, they do what makes sense and what is easy for them. In Christensen's case, they keep selling to the same customers without realizing that customers' needs can change in ways that the customers don't realize. It's like when you order the special at a restaurant. You didn't plan on ordering that special when you got there, but it sounded good. Your needs changed. And once someone articulated that, once someone manifested something that you didn't know you wanted, you selected. In TED Talk tradition, Trisha weaves her way back to where she began. The oracle was high as a kite because the temple sat on gas spewing from earthquake vaults. And luckily there were temple guides who helped the oracle and translated her mumbo-jumbo into helpful hints. And she thinks that in the same way the oracle needed temple guides, our big data systems need them too. They need ethnographers and user researchers who gather thick data, like stories, emotions, and interactions. Think not in large samples answering simple questions, but small samples answering deep ones. This tweak takes work. Trisha cites Grant McCracken, an ethnographer who helped Netflix figure out how to get people to watch more. McCracken is one of the people you can thank for binge watching being so simple. And in one of his talks, he highlighted the same problem, this affinity for numbers. He said, when a senior manager says, fine, that's what you think, where are the numbers? And the best we can do is say, just trust us. It's like, yeah, right, I'm not trusting my career, my children's opportunity to go to college on your impression. Where's the data? By data, they don't mean I did an ethnography in someone's kitchen. They mean, could I please have some numbers? One of McCracken's points is about the artisanal trend. He says that if we could have sat at a table at Ches Panee in 1971, we would have had 50 years of early notice of some of the changes that have taken place in rock CPG companies. And so that's what we mean by thick data. It's talking to people and going out into the real world and asking questions and maybe finding out what the latent needs are and then using data to refine those ideas. Rory Sutherland cited the work of Bent Fluberg, who is an academic that studies megaprojects. I found one of Fluberg's talk from the Harvard Graduate School of Design in 2013, and his talk was titled Follies of Infrastructure. Sutherland said he'd like to invite Fluberg to Nudgestock 2019. And why? Well, because Fluberg looks at planning mishaps through megaprojects. These are things like transportation infrastructure, IT systems, Olympic Games, public buildings, and dams. In his books and papers, Fluberg has found recurring problems due to consistent causes with reliable cures. The big problem with megaprojects is a lot of overpromising and under-delivering. In his 2013 talk, he said, "I'll only focus on cost overruns in my presentation, but that's only because of time constraints. I could present similar results for delays and benefit shortfalls." On average, rail projects overrun their budgets by 44%, bridges by 33%, and road projects by 20%. The Channel Tunnel exceeded its budget by 100%, and that seems high until you look at Boston's Big Dig, which was triple its budget, and the Sydney Opera House actually exceeded its budget by 14 times. And the architect who was in charge of the Opera House never did another project. Fluberg said, "He just turned 90 earlier this year." This was in 2013. "People often get surprised when I say that the Sydney Opera House is a mega-project disaster, but in the sense that it destroyed Jorn Utsson's career and the possibilities for the rest of the world to get their Utzon-designed buildings. It's Fluberg's favorite building in the world as well, but he also hates it because it destroyed a brilliant career. And he wants us to be more efficient, and the solutions to our inefficiency are not difficult. And this problem with infrastructure is not new. Tracked over the last 70 years, Fluberg reported that 9 of 10 megaprojects go over budget. And this actually surprised him. Think of all the changes since 1950. One thing that hasn't changed is our tendency to underestimate the costs and overestimate the benefits. In one calculation, the Channel Tunnel's IRR was negative 14%. And so he says that the British economy would have been better off had the tunnel never been constructed. And we think that maybe mega projects are an exception. I mean, can we forgive the planners? Fluberg thinks no, because the mistakes on all of these mega projects are the same mistakes. They follow a distinct and consistent pattern centered around 3 things. 1, technical, errors in data and models. 2, psychological, errors in optimism and expectation. And 3, political economic, what Fluberg calls strategic misrepresentations, which is a term I've learned to use because people don't like it when you say lying. Fluberg's categories are based on data, and if technical explanations were valid, you'd think that forecasting errors would be around a normal distribution. So in the same way that we saw that scale-free networks are a log distribution, kind of like airlines, Fluberg said that if these were random budgeting errors, if they were random technical errors, we would see something more like the interstate highway system, where you kind of have a lot in the middle and then a few at the ends. But that lack of randomness tells us something too. It's much like Hans Rosling's work. So maybe it's a Nordic thing, where if you look at data and you think that these are just mistakes, but it's not random, then there's something more going on. Fluberg said, "We can reject technical explanations as valid explanations with a very, very high level of confidence." In his presentations, Fluberg notes that there's often more than one cause for these effects. There's optimism mixed in with some strategic misrepresentation and a dash of underestimated costs. He said, "It's like Machiavelli, even though he died almost 500 years ago, is alive and well, working as a consultant to the people who are developing and implementing the project. what Machiavelli whispers in their ears to underestimate the costs, overestimate the revenues, undervalue the environmental impact, overvalue the developmental effects. If you do these things, my dear prince or promoter, you'll get funding. So what we need is a new culture and incentive structure, because what we reward now is we really reward things that have a wide variance, things that'll be amazing or disasters, and more likely we end up with disasters. Fluberg calls this inverted Darwinism, the way we've structured the incentive structure. Fluberg wants planners to use reference class forecasting, which is just using base rates. It's the best predictor of performance, is that it's a similar project. Find another stadium or road or anything and see how that went. This gets past what Danny Kahneman calls the planning fallacy, our tendency to think projects we are involved in will be completed much faster, cheaper, and better than other projects. And Kahneman experiences himself writing a textbook and then also writing Thinking Fast and Slow. And experts are as prone to the planning fallacy as novices are. To change this culture, to use reference class forecasting, to find base rates, we have to convince developers that projects are not one of a kind. Fluberg says, you hear this when you talk to project planners, as I do in my research. You will hear them say, you cannot compare projects, it's impossible, each project is unique. Our statistician laughs when he hears this because he says the curves of cost overruns and benefit shortfalls are so similar that it's ridiculous to talk about the projects as being unique. Facsimiles don't exist, but related projects do. You may not look just like your sibling, but there's a resemblance. A region has many airports, but a city has only one. Planners should look at the regional lessons, and critics should ask for those parameters. And the thing doesn't have to be perfect, but it should at least set a ballpark for your town's new ballpark. Fluberg highlighted a series of Frank Gehry projects that have each come in closer to budget thanks to better planning. The Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles was almost twice its budget, whereas the Bilbao, the Guggenheim Museum in Spain, was on time and on budget, so it can be done. Fluberg said, even for such difficult projects, it's been possible to get to a situation to build on time and on budget again and again. The big point, the overall idea at Nudgestock 2018 is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Rather than tearing down and starting fresh, we can have large changes by making tweaks and tracking results. Caroline Webb talked about how to have a better day with a new mindset. Rory Sutherland talked about how companies can offer better choices with limited options. Ruth Morgan talked about how forensic scientists might be more like Sherlock Holmes. Nicholas Christakis talked about how networks matter. Albert Laszlo Barabasi talked about the structure of networks too. Mark Brooks talked about better dating with data. Steve Krug talked about usability testing and small changes. Tricia Wong talked about thick data combined with big data. And Bent Fluberg talked about the consistent mistakes on rare projects. Maybe the subtitle to Nudgestock 2019 will be Small Actions. Small works so well because it relies on behavior. If you get people to see something in a new way or behave in a new way, it can have large effects. That's the secret to a good nudge. Thanks for listening to this episode of Mike's Notes.
Well, that's very nice. Thank you very much. Now, why don't you make like a tree and get out of here?
It's leave, you idiot. Make like a tree and leave. You sound like a damn fool when you say it wrong.
All right, then leave and take your book with you.